Hi, I'm Ty Plato, here with EMEAPP, the Electronic Music Education and Preservation Project. In this series of videos, we'll be going over some of the effects units that we have here in our collection. Today, we'll be looking at 3 classic fuzz units from the 1960s, as well as getting into some octave fuzz later on. But first, let's talk about the history of fuzz in general. The history of fuzz boxes starts with guitarists realizing that distortion, which before this point had been an unintended side effect of tube amplification, was actually pretty cool. Unfortunately for them, they didn't have very reliable ways to get it. Sure, you could turn your tube amp up really loud, but that doesn't create very much distortion. If you wanted more, you had to sacrifice your gear to the tone gods. The iconic distorted sound from the Kinks' You Really Got Me was created by destroying the speaker cone either with a razor blade or a pencil, depending on which Davies brother you ask. Now, obviously this wasn't very sustainable, though I'm sure it must have been great for the speaker cone industry. One day, while recording the Marty Robbins song, Don't Worry, a country song of all things, the guitarist's channel on the mixing board had a bad preamp that was creating a lot of distortion. The recording engineer on the session that day, a guy named Glenn Snoddy, decided to design a circuit that could replicate the sound of that bad preamp, and the fuzz pedal was born. At its core, fuzz is a very simple and somewhat crude circuit. Fuzz pedals use transistors made of germanium or silicon to generate the distortion. Each transistor acts like a tiny little amplifier, with the clean signal coming into the pedal and going into the first transistor, which just boosts that clean signal. Then it moves on to the next transistor, which can't handle that boosted signal and causes all the distortion. Then this just cascades through however many transistors are in the pedal and creates the distorted sound. For pedals like the ones that we'll be looking at today, 2 to 4 transistors is usually common. The first pedal we'll be looking at today is the one designed by Glenn Snoddy to replicate the sound of that bad preamp in the recording studio, the Maestro Fuzz tone. Now, here at EMEAPP, we have a bunch of different revisions and versions of this pedal, but this is the earliest one that we have. It's technically the second edition, the FZ1A versus the FZ1, but there aren't any major differences. Now, being the first guitar stomp box ever widely produced, nobody really knew what this thing was or how to use it, so the company actually also released a demo record showing off what it could do. They claim that it could make your guitar sound like other instruments, like a horn or a banjo.
It's mellow, it's raucous, it's tender, it's raw, it's the Maestro Fuzz tone.
It probably sounded a lot more convincing to people who had never heard a guitar pedal before, but you can be the judge. It's on YouTube for you to listen to. Unfortunately, even back then, a lot of people weren't convinced because nobody bought these. Until Keith Richards made them cool. The iconic fuzz guitar riff from Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones was recorded on one of these. Though it was originally meant to be a horn part, this was just a placeholder. The band's manager released the song to radio without telling them, and before the horn part could be added though. So, when people heard this, they didn't know it was supposed to be a horn part. But coincidentally, that was the same time that they all decided that, you know what, this thing was pretty cool. Most other early fuzz pedals can trace their origins back to the fuzz tone in some way, like the Vox Tone Bender. The Tone Bender was originally created in the UK as a modification of the fuzz tone that had more bass and more sustain. But this being made in the UK meant that it found its way into the hands of a lot of British guitarists, since importing the fuzz tone from the US would have been expensive and complicated at that time. Because this was more accessible to British guitarists, it became the sound of the British invasion thanks to the bands like Led Zeppelin and The Who. There are a lot of different variations of the Tone Bender, from the Mark I all the way through the Mark IV. This one is a Mark II. In between the Mark I and II tone benders, which used 3 transistors, there was very briefly what we call the Mark 1.5 tone bender, which only used 2. This model was only produced for a very short time, but one of those rare units found its way into the hands of Ivor Arbiter, who cloned it part for part into the fuzz face. Now these are built inside of old microphone stands, since making custom metal parts was expensive, hence why they're so round and large, even though there's really not much going on in here. You know the sound of the fuzz face from Jimi Hendrix, most likely, and we actually own Jimi Hendrix's fuzz face here at EMEAPP. This is not it. This is just a different vintage fuzz face that we have. But here's a picture of Jimi Hendrix's fuzz face, just to make you happy. So we've introduced these three iconic 60s fuzzes. Let's hear how they sound compared to one another. So first up we have the Maestro Fuzz tone, which is pretty simple. It was the first one. They were just learning. All we have back here is just a volume and attack. Pretty simple stuff. To try and get a sort of more modern fuzz sound rather than whatever they were trying to do with this back then, I usually tend to keep the attack knob just all the way up, dimed out, and it does get a pretty nice sound. The annoying thing is that with this being one of the earliest models, the cable is hardwired into the pedal, so I have to unplug the cable from my guitar and just use this one for this pedal only. None of the other pedals are like that. So you're actually kind of discovering this along with me right now. This is just a cool sound that I just came up with. This is you can play light and it stays pretty clean, but then just like once you start to dig in, then you really get the you get a very aggressive like bite in there almost. So it's almost working more like an overdrive than a fuzz pedal the way it is right now. So So next up here we have the tone bender, which again pretty simple. It was just a mod of the fuzz tone after all. So we just same attack is still attack, level is volume from before. It seems like on this one, most of the distortion is really only activated with this top little portion of the knob here. It doesn't really get much use out of the whole rest of the range here, just this little bit right at the top, so. So the last pedal that we have here is the fuzz face, which, since it only uses 2 transistors like we mentioned earlier, there's not quite as much distortion as with the other 2. It still is a pretty iconic sound, so let's take a look. It's definitely a different sound from the other two. This one, it feels more like chunky, I guess is the word that I would use to describe this, rather than like the other two, which were a lot more crunchy. It's not, I don't enjoy it quite as much as I do the others, but obviously it's still a very iconic sound, and it's sometimes that's what you want. You just like, you just kind of want like a big sort of messier sound almost. So So now you've heard the three pedals that we looked at today. My personal favorite was the Tone Bender because it does a really great classic rock crunch sound. The Fuzz Face sounded chunky, and the Fuzz Tone was somewhere in between. To learn more about any of these pedals, or any of our other gear, check us out online at EMEAPP.org or on social media.